The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The company wished me to express their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking around. Please understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes blank. She hardly seemed to be breathing. Her husband's face looked as a soldier's might as he entered his first battle. I was to say that Ma and Meggins have no responsibility for what happened, continued the other. They are not to blame at all. But as your son was their employee, they wish to present you with a sum of money to assist you. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" $2,000 was the answer. Not hearing his wife shriek, the old man smiled faintly. He put out his hands like a blind man and dropped, unconscious, to the floor. In the huge new cemetery 2 miles away, the old people buried their dead son. They came back to a house filled with shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly believe it. They kept expecting something else would happen, something that could lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed and they began to feel a hopeless acceptance. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about. Their days were long and weary. It was about a week later that the old man woke suddenly in the night and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of quiet weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept more. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed on and off, and then slept until a sudden cry from his wife startled him. "The monkey's paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He jumped up in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You haven't destroyed it?" "It's in the living room on the table," he replied, confused. "Why?" She cried and laughed at the same time and, bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said excitedly. "Why didn't I think of it before?" "Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other two wishes," she replied. "We've only had one." "Wasn't that enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried happily. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man leapt up in bed and flung the blankets back. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried, horrified. "Get it!" she panted. "Get it quickly, and wish! Oh, my boy, my boy!" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," insisted the old woman. "Why not the second?" "It was a coincidence," stammered the old man. Go and get it and wish, cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the living room, and then to the little table. The paw was in its place. He was suddenly filled with horrible fear. Could his unspoken wish bring his son, horribly damaged, into the room before he could escape? In the dark he could not find the door, and his forehead grew cold with sweat. He felt his way around the table and along the wall until he found himself with the awful thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he said unsteadily. "Wish!" replied his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The paw fell to the floor where he looked at it, shuddering. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle burned just below the rim of the china candlestick. It threw flickering shadows on the ceiling and walls, and until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it went out. The old man felt unspeakably relieved that the charm had failed. He went back to bed, and a minute or two later, the old woman lay silently beside him. Neither spoke, but both lay listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily throughout the wall. The darkness was unpleasant. After lying for some time, trying to get up his courage, the husband took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he paused to strike another. At the same moment, a knock, so quiet he barely heard it, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, not breathing until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and ran swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, sitting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock sounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling. "I forgot it was 2 miles away." "What are you holding me for?" "Let go! I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in!" cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go!" "I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. With a sudden movement, the old woman broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed her to the landing and called her to come back as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle and the bolt at the bottom of the drawer drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The door," she cried loudly. "Come down. I can't reach it."